Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here. Tonight's talk is part of our current research studio series, Annotations, which takes an experimental approach to presenting research and work in progress, and is indicative of the direction of the research library at the Jameel Arts Center, Dubai, opening in winter 2018. The studio, titled Interdisciplinary Practices of the Early 80s UAE, follows Art Jameel's collaboration with Rock, Paper, Scissors, Positions in Play, the National Pavilion, United Arab Emirates 2017 exhibition curated by Hamad Nasser at this year's Venice Biennial, and takes as inspiration an interview done with poet Khaled al-Budur and artist Nujum al-Ghanem. The research undertaking particularly looks into the collaborative, multidisciplinary stance taken by artists, poets, playwrights, theater directors, and writers at the time and today. The room outside features an alternative reading of UAE's creative community, radical work, and many collaborations that shape this history and ongoing narrative. I'd like to welcome our speakers, Cristiana De Marchi, visual artist and writer, and Bana Kattan, exhibitions curator at the New York Abu Dhabi Art Gallery, who kindly accepted our invitation for a conversation exploring the multifaceted role of the artists, legacies of formative contemporary movement, and transient trajectories within the UAE art scene and its multi-layered history. Cristiana De Marchi is an Italian-Lebanese visual artist and writer who lives and works in Beirut and Dubai. She received her MFA with honors in archaeology at the University of Turin, with a dissertation about the urbanism of Greco-Roman Middle Eastern colonial capital cities. Cristiana explores through performance, video, and installations of embroidered objects and tapestries issues related to verbalization and translation, to the correspondence between physical, nominal dimensions. Some of her themes are the use of language in propaganda, the transition between territories, the redefinition of memory and identity, displacement and belonging, and the porous borders that separate regions while allowing contact. A writer and poet, Cristiana shows through her work a deep attention to the power and influence of words, to the role of narratives, to the possibilities of word associations, and to meaningful breaks. Bana Kattan's recent curatorial projects include Invisible Threads, Technology and its Discontents, which featured work by 15 artists ranging from Ai Weiwei to Munira Al-Qadiri, and But We Cannot See Them, tracing a UAE art community 1988 to 2008. During her graduate work at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, she worked at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago and the curatorial department of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi project in New York, and went on to be project manager for artist Michael Rakowitz. Kattan was one of the 2015 recipients of the Getty CAA International Program grants. She is born and raised in Abu Dhabi. The recent But We Cannot See Them exhibition was curated by Maya Allison, who's here today, along with Bana, and is accompanied by a fantastic publication that I urge you to go through. It is featured here in the studio along with other material, very much part of the bigger rhetoric that this project is in dialogue with. I ask you all to kindly have your phones on silent during the talk.
So one of the questions that we asked Cristiana in the interview was how she met everybody at the Flying House and how she even knew about the Flying House. This is one of the quotes from the interview. Was their job description? No, they needed help, so I sent them a poem. And so this is that poem. So I was going to invite Cristiana to tell us the story about this poem and about that day that she first encountered the Flying House.
Thank you. So definitely, that was the beginning of the encounter with the group of the Flying House. Of course, I mean, this group has been this group of artists, including and gravitating around Hassan Sharif, has been labeled in different ways according to the period of time when they were they were active. So they are also known as the 5 UAE, which is one of the main denomination, and that one that we used in another show that we are going to talk about a bit later. But at the time when I met them, it was the beginning of the Flying House. So the Flying House was founded in late 2007, and I met them in April, exactly on the 24th of April of 2008. At the time, I was kind of looking for a job, and I read an article which I think was published in the Gulf News. It was one of the first features about the Flying House. And so I met Abderrahim, and I met the whole group. I mean, my interaction was with Abderrahim, and based on a kind of, let's say, professional meeting. So I went to the house, which was in Al Quoz residential area. And I was introduced to the artists who were there. It was like Saturday afternoon, early afternoon, so they were having their lunch. And then I had a conversation with Abderrahim, and we remained that I would send something about how, I mean, I was seeing my collaboration with them. And so I drafted an email where I like my bullet thing, like a few things that I was considering. And then I wasn't really like very satisfied about that, which I shared with Abderrahim anyway. But I decided to add actually the translation of I wrote the poem in Italian initially, so I translated a few paragraphs of the poem, and I put them on the top of the email as a. I don't know why did I do that, in fact, because it was not like something that, let's say, I was encouraged to do, or it was definitely, I think I felt a sort of, I wanted to convey a message with that, like feeling that it was not like a very typical professional relation that I wanted to engage in, but I wanted to engage with them as a group as well. Which eventually happened. I started collaborating with the Flying House on the 1st of May of 2008, and I worked with them until fall 2012.
And can you tell us who are the people that you worked with in the beginning, about the people that came and left, but also about all the different hats that you wore while you were there? I know you were a cultural producer, you were a curator, you helped with the archive, which Abderrahim was very into and he took care of a lot. So you were wearing a lot of hats, but there were also a lot of people surrounding you. If you could talk to us about both of those.
Yeah, well, at the time, initially I was working mainly with Jos Clevers, who was acting as a curator. Jos was a friend of the group of the Flying House. I mean, of these artists since the 90s, and he was a Dutch artist and curator himself. He was running an art center in Sittard, Netherlands, and he organized one of the first exhibitions, perhaps the very first, if Abderrahim wants to correct me, in Europe. And then he was the person who actually created the link with the Aachen, the Ludwig Center Museum in Aachen, where the denomination of the 5 UAE would start, because the title of that exhibition was exactly in the English translation, the 5 UAE. So Jos has played a very important role in the relation with these Emirati contemporary artists and conceptual artists. And in 2007, so he comes to Dubai to kind of not run the Flying House as he would have run his art center in Sittard, but to help also organizing, curating, and spreading the voice about this group of artists. So I curated a couple of shows with Jose, and then unfortunately Jose fell ill in the fall of 2008, and he went back to the Netherlands for treatment and passed away early 2009. So at that time I continued the mission as a curator, mostly working with Mohammed Kazem and curating, writing, and as well assisting Abderrahim with the growing archive of the Flying House, because of course everyone was producing work, starting with Hassan, who was extremely prolific. So that implied the documentation. Valsalan was documenting the works photographically, and so it was a very small team, let's say, and working on multiple aspects, writing for articles for newspapers, for like trying to do everything in our possibilities to create attention around this group of artists.
Tell me more about your experience with the archive, because the next thing we're going to talk about is work that Christiana did based on the archive. And Abderrahim was working on the archive prior to Christiana joining. So I kind of just want, if you can, just paint a picture of the archive. What are the types of things that they were archiving? What are the types of documents that they were saving, the art, how were they, storing and conserving? And
well, as you mentioned, Abderrahim started archiving very, very early, and it was. We have to mention first that Hassan was very conscious about the importance of documenting his works. So even from the very early years of his artistic practice back in UK, he started like photographing. Hassan never properly used photography as an artistic medium, but he used photography for documenting, and luckily, I mean, regardless of works which were lost in the process or during the years, but he kept a lot of documentations, a lot of papers, a lot of handwritten papers from the old time, and Abderrahim was gathering these informations, and then he decided to code them, which is an interesting aspect, because of course Hassan wasn't that systematic in let's say keeping his own documents, but Abderrahim created a code and he divided into categories. So we had like the objects, we had the semi-systems, we had performances, the early experimental works, and everything was like coded with a letter and a number, and then we were trying to keep track of everything. So with, I mean, we had like a full spreadsheet, which was really like quite exhaustive for us, at least. Then, of course, more experienced archivists would have done better than what we did. But that was a very important element. For instance, when Catherine David came in 2009, 2008, and then she curated the first a Dutch pavilion in 2009, and then she curated with Mohammed Kazem the exhibition in the solo exhibition for Hassan in Abu Dhabi. Those informations were available. It was like digging into something which was like quite organized and where it was possible to get oriented.
Curator's dream.
Yeah, well, otherwise I don't know how anyone could have navigated the amount of works produced by Hassan over that period of time without a proper archive, or at least, I mean, something which was, I think it's very close to a proper archive, and definitely it's one of the most exhaustive we have in the UAE so far.
Yeah, yeah. Which leads us to the first work that I want to discuss. For a couple of people don't know that Christiana is a poet. She's been writing poetry since the age of 13, right?
That's right.
And the first artwork that I want to talk about is actually a project that she did with Hassan Sharif. And yes, here's the book for it. Christiana, tell us about this project.
Yeah. It's interesting because you link it to the archive, and in fact, I mean, I've worked on Hassan's archive, but then I felt like I needed to have a very personal interaction with that, which was like going beyond my, let's say, occupation to and more like professional curatorial occupation. And so I was really intrigued by Hassan's performances, which is a very specific body of works between 1982 and 1984. So it's like a very contextualized period of time, and it's a very small body of works. Although, in my opinion, one of the real most significant body of works. And so I wrote a poem in response to each one of these performances of Hassan. And
there are 29, by the way.
Yeah,
29 different poems. Yeah, about 29 different.
There are the whole performances, and there are 2 experiments. I mean, they fall into the category of the experiments, but I felt they were like performance to me, so I reacted to those 2 as well. So there are these group of poems, and so I wrote these poems back in 2009 as well. They had a long story, I mean, editorial story, let's say. But, and of course, when I finished my poems, I gave them to Hassan to read. And I wanted to see how would he react to that. And so he kept the poems with him for a few days. And then he told me basically that he couldn't give me like a response which was just like a response based on words, that he needed to do something with these poems. And he made an amazing piece of art. He built boxes for these poems, and he asked me to rewrite the poems many times. We photocopied. There is one...
I'm going to skip ahead.
Yeah, there is one version which is the handwritten, and then there are the printed poems, and then he just like used them like in a very I don't know, in a very personal way indeed. So he built this amount of boxes where my poems are basically hidden. And you can just like see few words, but you can never see or read the whole thing. Which goes back, I mean, to the use of boxes and books that Hassan has done before, and we exhibited this work in the show curated by Catherine David and Hamad Kazem in Abu Dhabi in 2011.
So just to backtrack real quick, so this book, this original book,
and then Sharjah Foundation produced the book, which was launched in March 2016 during Art Dubai.
Yeah, so this is the original poem that was written based on this performance. So Christiana writes a poem about the performance, and then Hassan does a piece based on the poem, which is about his performance. So it's layers and layers and layers. So my question is, how involved are you and Hassan in making the work? Is it a call? Is it a call and a response? So you're responding to him, and then he's responding to you, or are these projects that you consider that you've done with Hassan, and then this is a project that he did with you?
No, I consider it more as a responsive kind of relation. I definitely wrote the poems without Hassan knowing that I was writing the poems, and I even recall a conversation with Abdurrahim when he was telling me, like, he was telling me, oh, I noticed that lately you're staying even longer at the Flying House, and I told him, yeah, you know, I'm writing poems about Hassan's performances, and it was really important for me to write them in the Flying House. I don't know, I mean, I could have written them everywhere, of course, but it was really like a kind of, I don't know, incubator space for me, And so definitely Hassan was not aware that I was writing the poems, and I knew because he told me that he was going to make this artwork, and I was involved to the extension that he asked me to rewrite the poems, to have a version which was handwritten that he wanted to use for the work, but not in terms of let's say interacting in the making or anything. That is completely like Hassan's work, and I feel I always consider it like he has been the best reader of my poetry. Indeed, I mean, no one has like paid so much attention to what I've written to the point to spend that amount of time and energy and passion into making a piece of art out of that. So I really see it as a response more.
And so you didn't show him any of the poems until you were completely
they were
done
finished.
With
yes,
29.
I just gave him like as if it was the manuscript. Yes.
Oh. I just want to go back to this poem that I chose out of the 29, only because I had to choose one. And I especially like the final part of it. It's a lie when we pretend not to appear. The dialogue needs two poles, and words flow through the body. I like the dialogue between the two poles, and especially the part that says the words flow through the body. Can you tell us about this section?
Yeah,
I can tell you.
There is a kind of evolution, I would say, in the poems, because when I started, and I really felt like the first few poems I wanted to respond to the performances.
So this is one of the ones near the end of the book.
Yeah. So the first few poems, I feel like they are more like descriptive in a way. So it's really like me trying to verbalize the experience of the performance and to translate it into something that gives them a movement. By moving through the experience, I started kind of projecting more of myself into the poems. So many of the poems become occasions where I create a parallel between the performance of Hassan and experiences in my personal life, and I try to create a line of contact. So I really like that you chose this one, because the two poles are definitely a very essential element in the conversation. That I mean, it was a silent conversation in the beginning, at least for me, but not less relevant, nevertheless.
Aside from the performances that Christiana is talking about here, she actually did an exhibition that we would like to mention.
Maybe I should also add another one thing, because there is something like I mean, there's a mention of the body, and the body is really like something very. Of course, I mean, when we talk about performance, body is like by definition is essential, and my whole relation with the work of Hassan really started through the body. So I even made a performance out of that, which is in the English translation. I titled it in Italian. So the English translation is basically "I understand through the body," and I performed in front of some of Hassan's works in a way that kind of replicated the work, and it was like my own like embodying of the work, and yeah. So that the words flow through the body is again another line that recalls that other experience. And then, as you were mentioning, I curated this exhibition, which is Mind Body, and some of you might have seen that was in 2013. Actually, I wrote the first concept for the show in 2010.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Then again, I mean, all these things were moving very slowly at the time, so there was never like the occasion to organize the show until 2013. And also, I mean, just it's important for me to say this, I mean, in terms of dates, because I first write the concept of this exhibition, which is basically focusing on performance and the use of body in the GCC, which is like something quite neglected, or at least it was when back in 2010.
And that's partially why. So when Christiana was telling me about this and how she considers this exhibition such an important part of her career, she spoke about it as a study of an archive in itself. This particular exhibition.
Yeah, well, I see it that way because, of course, performances, especially the first performances are Hassan's performances. So we are going back to the 80s, and then we have performances from the 90s and even early 2000. But performances here until very, very recent were not like supposed to have an audience. So the only way to document a performance would be like through photography, not even video. Video was not, regretfully, was not used. And therefore, it's the starting point is an archive in the end. So we are showing a kind of archive, we are showing a kind of documentation of something which happened, which implies like a spatial and temporal dimension, but is like documented only through stills. And then, I mean, I was really... how can I say? In 2012, I don't know if anyone is aware of this, but there was a show in Paris which was titled Le Corps Découvert, so the body, the discovered, undercovered body. I don't know how, I mean, exactly it would translate into English. And it was about starting with painting and everything which was like the Arab artist dealing with the body. And there was no mention at all of any artist from the GCC. And I really felt disturbed, just to say the least. So I was really like glad that I had a chance to curate this show in 2013. And then I kind of shared my text with professionals even in Europe to try to rectify this misconception that there was like not such a thing as a performance in the GCC. So that for me it's a very dear project to me.
The next exhibition I wanted to talk about is Old Gold, which is a very recent project that Christiana did with Mohammed, sitting over here. And the reason I think this is a very key exhibition in relation to the other things that we spoke about today is because of the premise of the show, which I should let Christiana talk about. Tell us about the premise of the show.
Yes. So basically, I mean, with Mohammed, we discussed a lot. We really wanted to reflect on the relation between generations of artists in the UAE. So we started with the 5 UAE, and we selected 10 younger artists. Let's say from the last generations of a generation of like already. Committed artists, but still very young, and we shared a lot of materials with them so that they have. Because many of them, they had a very poor knowledge about the 5 UAE, I must admit, and that was one of the elements that we wanted to take into consideration to try to understand if there is like a sort of continuity, if there is a sort of legacy. I mean, the element of the legacy and was very important to explore, and how these artists. Compare or reflect or engage with the practice of their elder fellow artists. And so it was a commissions-based project. So each one of the 10 younger artists produced a work in response to the practice of one of the artists of the 5 UA. Basically, it was a 1:2 ratio. in response in a very like different way as you might have experienced by visiting the show, because some of them really responded in a more literal way, and some others totally refused to respond, which was an interesting outcome of the exhibition. And it was really like an open and exhibition. We didn't want to assume anything. We really wanted to explore something that where we were personally like critical and doubtful about. And we also had a series of talks for a month, each one exploring some relevant issues about knowledge transmission and the recurrences, because that was like one of the aspects that, of course, you would notice even in the practice of the 5 UAE, where there are elements of recurrent elements, both in the use of materials, in ideas, which are explored at large by all of them. And so we wanted also to explore that. And the validation as another very critical aspect of the local environment, artistic environment. So yeah, basically.
So I have 2 questions. First of all, what is the vocabulary that you used when you met with the new generation of artists? Did you ask them to respond, or did you ask them to continue the conversation, or did you ask them to relate? How did you approach the younger generation with the work of the older generation? And my second question is, did you select the work that you were going to show from the older generation before showing it to the younger generation? And how did you select that work?
Yeah, well, we, as we said, we gathered a lot of documentation about the artist, sharing also the whole writings of Hassan with them, both in Arabic and in English, so which are like public domain. It's not like something, but I would say that most of them had, little or no knowledge about that at all. And I'm not sure until now how many of them, went thoroughly through the material and took full advantage of that opportunity. So definitely there was no obligation. We wanted them to have access to these materials in case they didn't see them before, because of course one of the premise of the exhibition was also in the educational system in the UAE, these artists are not taught. So there is no like chance for the younger generation to have access, academically speaking, to the practice of these artists. So we wanted to fill the gap with that and to give them a chance to have all these materials ready. And but then the response was totally free. So each one of them could respond to a specific work or to a general body of works or to a practice at large, to a philosophical approach, to whatever they were feeling like was significant to them in the practice of these 5 artists. And as I said, some of them consciously distanced themselves from the 5 UAE. And to respond to the answer to the second question, actually we selected the works for the 5 UAE before, but we didn't really share our selection with the younger generation. We didn't want them to respond to the works that we selected for the show, because we felt it would be like too directive and a bit like maybe, it was too much of a constriction anyway. We wanted to definitely keep it much more open.
Another thing that reminded me when I read about the curatorial premise of Is Old Gold is actually an interview that is published in But We Cannot See Them, that was done in 2009 by Christiana. She's interviewing Hassan Sharif. And in that interview, Hassan is talking about, we're talking about 2009, and in there he's talking about the work of Khalid Mizena. Khalid is still a young artist, but in 2009 he was a very young artist. Yeah. And this is what he says. I'll let you guys read it. So it's clear that Hassan is thinking about the work of young artists. He's following very young artists. And Old is Gold is kind of Christiana's way of being influenced by Hassan and doing the same thing. Which kind of leads me to Christiana's life today. So we spoke about her wearing all these hats. She was helping with the archive. She was clearly a curator. The most thing that we spoke about today is her curatorial projects. But finally, now we can see a slight focus in her career, if I can say that, where you're focusing on your art. Why is that? Is it because the ecosystem is now filling the gaps that you felt the need to fill because there are other people that weren't doing that? Or is this just the time that you chose?
Well, definitely, I think I share that condition of, let's say, filling the gaps with many other, not many maybe, but I mean with a few other artists, starting with Hassan certainly, who extensively, and I don't need to mention because everyone knows, I mean, wrote, translated, published, educated, so he really engaged with the younger generation of artists here, and then of course Mohammed Kazem as well, who taught another generation of Emirati artists and curated for long. I mean, to the extension of curating one of the Sharjah Biennale in 2007, co-curated at least. And
but Mohammed is definitely known more as an artist than a curator, and you're known more as a curator than an artist.
Yeah,
So-
well, maybe because when I came to the UAE and I started engaging with the UAE art scene, I started as a curator. I mean, that was the way I was introduced here. So there was a major focus on that, and people tend to kind of identify me with the role of a curator, although it's for me not perhaps the primary way I would identify myself. Yeah, and my artistic practice also was kind of hidden for a while, if not, I mean, longer. So it's not like not so many people are familiar with what I do as an artist. Perhaps that it's a bit about the occasions in the UAE, and also I really how can I say, I really started exhibiting in the UAE. So I was working as an artist before, long before, and but it was a very remote experience for me, and it was a very personal experience. So I never exhibited anything, and I really have to thank the group of the Flying House, because at some point through conversations they came to know that I'm working, and then they saw some of my works, and then I even brought Abderrahim was kind enough to store part of my works at some point, and there were not few, and and so I was really encouraged to show the works by Hassan, Mohammed Ahmed. The Flying House was not the right space for showing my work, because the mission of the Flying House was to show Emirati contemporary artists, and we wanted to stick to that mission without create any kind of confusion around who is exhibited and who is not. And so, let's say the story of my exhibition story was quite slow and late. Yeah, so that's perhaps why.
So
I'm better
how did
known
they
as a
find
curator.
out that you were an artist that was making art? So you've been working there for how long, and you're secretly making art on the side, and then somehow there's a discovery.
Well, it was not like secretly. I was just making my works, and then through conversations, at some point it came out that I I was making works, and so because our conversations, we had, of course, more like professional conversations in the sense that they were finalized to something, and then we had totally non-finalized conversations, which were most of them were just like discussing ideas and whatever everyone was doing at the time. And so at some point I felt like courageous enough to enter the conversation, not only from, let's say, an observational point of view, but also from a personal one. So that how it came out, yeah.
And when and where was the first time you exhibited?
Well, it was in early 2011 in Sharjah. Yeah, so that's quite recent.
Last question. And what should we look forward to? When is your next exhibition of your work?
Well, it's a bit. It will take some time because, as again, as everyone knows, I'm participating in the SIF program this year, which might be the occasion to start a conversation about what emerging artist means. And I wouldn't shy if anyone wants to provoke that kind of conversation. So I'm really like focused on the process of working for the next 8 or 9 months or so until the exhibition, which will be like the conclusive moment of the program. So I'm really like enjoying my studio practice at the moment.
Thank you. With that, we would like to open up to questions from the audience with this mic that will be passed around.
That was lovely. Thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to get a question clearly out, but I kept thinking about how in Once's project display exhibition, it's about that quote where Hassan says that I think poets are his favorites, or there's something like that about how he responded the most to poetry. I kind of loved learning about your entrance into this world by way of a poem. And then the production of your poems is equally interesting. I feel like the question I'm getting to is really weird. When I was reading your poem, I felt like it reminded me a lot of the kind of language of French feminist poetry, Sisu, words through the body. And as I was thinking about that, I realized that Hassan's work has a feminine energy too, if we're going to define that Sisu word-body relationship that way. And that was really interesting to me to think about this nurturing dialogic role that Hassan, as the father, mother of this arts group, wide and diverse, multidisciplinary, created. I can't come up with a clear question, but those connections were so interesting to me. And are there going to be other opportunities to bring the poetry back in? And I'm particularly fascinated by Adil, who is a great storyteller from that moment. Are we going to get him to do something as well?
No.
Because I'm asking you as well. Like, how does he engage with this post legacy of Hassan moment?
Adel, you mean?
I found a question in there that I just consider myself like.
Well, I don't know. I mean, as for myself, you're right. I mean, the bodily dimension is very strong. Is definitely very strong in my poetry, and I mean, luckily we are showing poems that are not. I mean, where I mean, I have poems that I could definitely not share in a public space. So, and I'm actually dealing with some kind of issues at the moment because we are going to publish 4 poems. Actually, we are going to republish this one that we had in at NYU with 3 new poems, but there is a little bit of a struggle concerning censorship. So, yes, well, I don't know if Hassan kind of responded to the poems specifically because of their nature, or he just like responded to the poems because he responded to poems beautifully, definitely. Yes. Yes, I mean, it was a conversation about also Adel and Khaled and Nujum have been very much influenced by ideas of Hassan, and it was a kind of circulation of ideas where I would say that perhaps the visualization that an artist can give to ideas was paralleled with the kind of verbalization that a poet could create at the same time. So, and it's more like a depiction of imagination, and in that sense, so I think they were sharing like visual ideas in a way in their conversations, but there was a common ground through even books that they were reading at the same time and sharing, of course, the access to international publications of a certain level, and was not that easy. So whenever they would have a book, they would just like encourage everyone to read it, or even Hassan was translating paragraphs of books wherever those who were less fluent with English could not access the original text. So it was really like the attempt to have everyone on the same page and to continue conversation, which was like really a shared conversation. So yeah, well.
For the research that we did for But We Cannot See Them, almost every single person that we interviewed mentioned poets, especially Ahmed Rashid Al-Thani is very, very mentioned. Almost everybody mentioned him. But then also we felt like the Adel, who you mentioned, was such a key poet that we didn't even interview him. We asked him to actually write. So he's the only person in here that's actually, and his piece is titled The Bridge of Knowledge and the Motor of Ideas, the Space and Reading Among the Generation of Modernization in the UAE. So again, what Christiana said about the reading was really important. And he had his archive of books in the exhibition, but we cannot see them. And some of those books actually had Hassan Sharif's handwriting, translating the English into Arabic, like above all the words. And yeah. So you can see like almost the live in the moment sharing of like literature and words and poetry.
I just thought it was really beautiful that a group of artists came together at that time, and they shared ideas and books and literature, and wanted everyone to be on the same page, and there was this brotherhood that was going on. And I'm wondering, do you see that today with young artists? How do you encourage that? Is it more individualistic, and how can we change that if that is the case?
Well, that was one of the questions that we had for the Is Old Gold as well. That was really the consideration about communities and how communities change or are created first, change, and then eventually come to an end, because there is also this component. I mean, I see the experience of this specific group of artists we are talking about gathering around Hassan and artists and poets as something which is not completely over, but is like kind of, it has evolved in a way as well. So there is not the same kind of energy, perhaps because there is less of an urgency. Today it's kind of different, and definitely I have some concerns about the role of market into that. For the younger generations, it's a very difficult question to answer. There are smaller groups of artists who share ideas, and I can see that maybe with less impactful outcome in a way. I mean, this group, especially Hassan, but because Hassan was writing out of the group, I mean, as one of the artists who was writing, but then of course also the other writers, they were very active socially in papers. I don't see that much with the younger generation. I see them more like focused on their own practice. And although I don't think everything has been solved and we are like happy now. I mean, certainly many things have improved over time, but there are still many aspects that would require public conversations, debate, and discussions. Maybe they are happening in different contexts. Like, I mean, we are here tonight to talk about those experiences. It is less of a mission for the younger generation. It's funny because Hassan, in that interview that we published here, so in the interview that I had with him, at some point he says that, oh, but maybe today, and that was like in 2009, we need to be wiser. And I feel the younger generation is wiser. I mean, wiser to regards of with regards to their interaction with the society and the system. I mean, maybe a bit too wise, I would say.
More about the work as archivist, about the archive, what you were doing, and it was only from Hassan Sharif artworks or for the whole Fly House, and if there is a database, tell me about this a little bit deeper.
Well, I think Abderrahim could answer with more. If he feels like, otherwise I will just say a few words, and then I mean, basically what Abderrahim started and we continued together, but it was more like a continuation of something which was in place already. It was a full documentation of the works, not only of Hassan's works, but also of Hossein Sharif, who is the brother of Hassan, Muhammad Kazem, Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim, and then of some other artists who were, especially in the beginning of the Flying House, also with the group, including Leila Juma. And so basically it was a typical kind of archive. So there was like each work was coded, and then we would just like record the dimensions, materials, exhibition places, wherever. That was like a huge thing that we tried to do, especially for Hassan, to try to remember wherever the work was exhibited, and try to gather like Abderrahim to link it also with articles and newspapers. So it was like a very multifaceted archive, and so and a lot of. Yeah, well, that is a separate archive. It's so we had a kind of archive for the works, and then there is like an archive for everything which has been published, and so lots of papers or document or photographs of papers where the papers were not available anymore, including like all the caricatures that Hassan published back in the 70s, and then of course each work would be photographed, and that was Valsalan's occupation. So we were trying to kind of be to cover all different aspects with limited resources. I mean, especially human resources. Abderrahim did it for many years beside his daily job. So yeah, I definitely it was definitely easier for me to continue to work with Abderrahim on that, and yeah. So, but it's available. It's not as a public. It's not public. I mean, it's with the Flying House, so it's not like something that you would find in a library or. That's if that is the question. I mean, there's no like a kind of. I don't know. I mean, that maybe Abderrahim again, you could answer that question if there is any possibility to access the archives of the Flying House. That I could not say.
For Hassan, now we have catalog raisonné, which details every moment of the work, history of the work, exhibition, publications, and so on. But the work Christiana is referring to, archiving, that's not available to the public, no. Because it's of no use as such to general public. This is what we believe.
Also, Hassan Sharif's website has an unbelievable amount of information in it. I mean, there's so much of the writings that Hassan wrote that they were speaking about, they're almost all online. Anybody can access them at any time. Yeah, and they're translated, exactly, which is really nice.
I was just interested in the comment about education and how it's not being taught in universities, and I just wondered whether with the recent publication or the recent exhibition at NYU, now there's textbooks that are very, like there's no reason for it not to be taught at universities, and certainly all the university professors are part of this arts community, and I guess and I just wonder whether you think that this recent, exhibition sort of saturation of late will contribute to this being taught at universities.
Really quickly before I pass it to Christiana, the book, but we cannot see them. The goal of it was for it to be a source book. So the idea is that there's all this information scattered, and we wanted to take all of that and put them into one publication. However, it is not an art history. So when a professor is teaching a class, I think creating this leading to people writing an art history is, in my opinion, what is needed.
Well, I cannot, of course, answer that question from an institutional point of view. And we have to make like a slight rectification, because there was one very courageous teacher, professor at the Sharjah College of Art, who is Elizabeth Stoney, who actually built a course about these artists, and she brought the students, including Sheikh Al-Mazrou, who was, the first time we were introduced to her, and she was introduced to the practice of Hassan, which was then has been like so referential for her until now. And so she came with the students and visited the Flying House. That was the very one exception. Well,
thank you all for coming, and thank you for your questions. Christiana will be here if anybody wants to ask her any other questions.